The folks at Bledner Foundation have just recently announced the release of Blender 4.1 the beta, and the idea behind this release is for everyone to download and test it and report for bugs before this is finally released. And for those who like to get this, you can simply go over to the download section and scroll all the way down to where you find Download Blender Experimental. Now once you click on that, you would notice that we have 4.1 the beta and 4.2 the alpha is available. Although 4.2 has literally nothing on it since it's exactly the same thing with 4.1. But then if you like to take a look at some of the cool things that will be coming over to 4.1, then you can go over to the release note and take a look at these. And from what we have here, we can see that Eevee and the viewport has no update. We're also not getting update for grease pencil, and the same thing can be said for shading and texturing. Meanwhile, for compatibility, the supported operating systems and graphic cards are the same with 4.0. Libraries have been updated to match the VFX platform of 2024, which includes Python 3.11, the OpenColor IO 2.3, the OpenAXR 3.2, the OpenVDB 11.0, OpenShader Language 1.13, and USD 23.11. And going all the way up, let's take a look at some of the cool improvement and the slight little set of features that will be coming to 4.1. Starting off with the user interface. With Blender 4.1, the beta opened up right here. There are a few things that you notice within the UI. Basically, if you're just looking at the UI face value, there is little to no update actually. But then you start noticing a couple of nice little updates here and there if you're very familiar with 4.0 and you're just using 4.1 for the first time. One of them includes this, that if you drag out a new panel and you right click, you now notice that these now have icons. Another thing which you'd also notice is if you go over to the scene section, that we now have placeholders within the camera, background, and also active clip. With previous versions of Blender, this wasn't available, and this just simply gives the user a hint of what should be expected or the value of the input that should be placed in there. The next update needs us to load up Blender 4.0 so we can take a look at these two. So one of the things I would like to show you guys is with the windows. So if we drag out the new panel with 4.0 and we go over to the windows, you notice how this just simply spreads out. With 4.1, however, this doesn't spread out like that. So if you drag out and you click, this becomes a drop-down menu, which I simply love. So we can go over to the asset browser from here, rather than doing this and having it cover the entire space. Another thing which you'd also notice is if you're working with 4.0 and you do throw in, for example, Susan the monkey, let's go ahead and subdivide this model, you can right-click and set this to Shade Auto Smooth. Of course, within the Shade Auto Smooth, you also have angles which you can turn on and turn off like this. In 4.1, this is no longer there. So I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of that, and we're just going to go in and take a look at the monkey. And then if we simply right click, you would notice that we now have Shade Smooth by Angle. This is now part of the geometry node setup that comes with Blender. And of course, you can do this directly on the viewport if you want and proceed to play with this. So for example, you want to do all of that. Yes, you can. But then if you want it to be very procedural and you like to work with that, you can also do this by going over to the essentials, and within the essentials, you would notice that you now have the smooth by angle. So this can be click, dragged, and dropped onto any model of choice, and you can go over to your properties section where you can now make these tweaks yourself. There's also an improved color picker, cursor indicator, and feedback. I love the new one, and you can also notice that once you're playing with the pointer, that the pointer itself just simply magnifies to show you more of what you're doing. The same thing happens with the light and shadow values, as once you slide this up and down, you do get that feedback that you're actually doing something with the mouse, rather than just second guessing if you've clicked it or not. Another interesting update that you might also want to take a look at, especially if you're into animation, and this is particularly for the user interface and for those who like working with shortcut keys, is this, that if you're working in Blender 4.0 and you tap I on the keyboard, the keyframe menu pops up. That is no longer the case here. At this point, if you tap I on the keyboard, you're actually placing a keyframe. And actually, let's just move this to about a point like that. Tap G on the keyboard, raise this all the way up, and tap I on the keyboard. We now add another keyframe right here. And so the question is, where is the keyframe menu? That can now be summoned with the shortcut key K. So for you to see that, if you do right click, you would notice that the insert keyframe with key inserting is now an addition to what we have compared to what we had here before. Something else within the UI, which is pretty subtle, but I think a few of you guys would notice, is if you go over to the outliner has now been slightly cleaned out. So instead of having these stick arrows, we now have arrows like that. Also, if you're working in animation, the bone collections are now hierarchical and the bone collections are shown in the tree instead of a flat list. They can be rearranged and nested via drag and drop, and the outliner can also show the bone collection hierarchy. Speaking about the bone collection hierarchy, bone collection is only visible when the parents or the grandparents are visible, and in this way, hiding a bone collection will also hide all of the children that comes with it. And more about the user interface includes that Kema fonts have been added to support the new translation of that Cambodian language. The UI interface font can now be shown in any weight, and if you're working with the file browser list view removes columns and reformats as the width decreases. The file browser tooltip now shows the Blender version, the image dimension, and video details, and so on. Text object fonts now look in the fallback stat when characters are not found. There's an animation marker drawing improvement, and there's also a general improvement in text overall. Background images can now be shown with render color transforms applied, and like we mentioned with 4.0, the eyedropper can now pick colors outside of Blender window on a Mac. Although, when we did try this on a Mac, this didn't seem to be the case, because at every single time we were selecting the eyedropper, around Blender's UI, you can select the color, but the minute you go out, the image turns black. So it's either I'm doing something wrong or this needs to be taken a look at again. And in 4.1, there's also this new cool feature, which I think a lot of you guys would like. If you go over to File, go over to Open Recent, you can now see the thumbnail of all of the files that you've opened before. The thumbnails also include the version of Blender that these were created in, the file size, and also the dates they were created or last modified. So this way, you don't need to rely on the file browser to see the thumbnails, as you can simply scan through to see them, and this is something that's currently not available in 4.0. Also, there are some updates to the image editor, the node editor, the outliner like we mentioned, and also within the 3D viewport, there are a few updates that deals with the work mode, which now supports relative up and down when you use the F and the R key, and improve mesh edge highlighting, improve contrast and text overlay, and a couple more options. And for those working with Linux, the input method editors are now supported for Wayland. And for modeling, there are a few options right here. The first one is the auto smooth, which we've already talked about, and they do have a new curve type support with new operators, as the draw tool now has an option to create knob curves directly. There's also the extrude operator, the duplicate operator, and also operators to control the tilt. And for VFX and video, there's a couple of updates to the compositor, the sequencer, and also audio. The sequencer is getting some performance optimization. The Luma wave display calculation is now 8 to 5 times faster, and in terms of effect, glow is now 6 to 10 times faster. The wipe is also 6 to 20 times faster. The gamma cross is now 4 times faster. Gaussian blur is 1.5 times faster. Solid color is also 2 times faster, and the timeline user interface repaints or refreshes 3 times to 4 times faster for complex timelines. Various parts of the image transformation, movie frame reading and writing, color management, and audio resampling are all sped up to boost performance when working with the sequencer. There's also a few updates to the filtering and also for scopes, which now brings a bit of improvement to the visual look of the scopes within the sequencer. And for animation, there are updates to the bone collection like we mentioned. The NLA is having a new channel option to Action Bake. There's also an added Bake custom properties to Action Bake, and the NLA channels are now renamed to NLA tracks. And if you're a rigging artist, you probably love this, and this has to do with bone selection when you're doing your weight painting. The bone selection mode is made explicit when you've entered your weight painting mode with an amateur. The following selections can also be added to make the bone selection more easier, and this includes the tweaking selection. And if we take a look at what we have in Blender, you would notice that this feature sounds good on paper, but it is not yet available. So the whole idea here is whenever you're weight painting, you should be able to go from 1, which is the default face selection, all the way to 2, and then to 3, where you can select the bones. So there should be another icon right here as described within the proposal. But currently, that doesn't seem to be available at this point, and again, I do guess that this is something that we will be getting with the final release of 4.1. And for the graph editor, there's a couple of updates which include scale from neighbor operator. There's also the option to automatically lock key movements to either X or Y axis, and this can be found under the view auto lock axis. Additionally, for the graph editor, there's the add option to right click menu on animated properties to view the F curve that animates it. And within the F curve, there's a new operator for baking channels, and there is also some updates for the dope sheet and motion path. Currently, for the motion path, there's an option to create motion path relative to the active camera when looking through that camera. For shape keys, there is just one tiny update, and this has to do with the fact that shape keys can now be locked to protect them from accidental edits via sculpting or edit mode, transformation tools, and operations. Now in this case, what we've just done is create a blend shape, and we're going to create a new one which has to do with the character probably surprised or amazed. And once we're done with this, we can now simply play with the values just to make sure that everything is working. And if we choose to go back to modify this shape key, you'd notice that we can no longer do that. This is applicable to both the sculpting and also the edit mode, and this is quite interesting. And for those who work with geometry node, the bake node now allows for saving and loading intermediate geometries. Baking no longer loses materials. Duplicate data in bakes is beta deduplicated, resulting to a much smaller file. In cases with identical geometries and attributes, volumes can now be baked, and the bake cache is no longer lost after undo. There's a few set of nodes that are coming to 4.1, which includes the Musgrave texture, which was replaced by an extended noise texture node. There's also the menu switch node, the split to instance, the index switch, the sort element, and the rotate rotation, which now replaces the rotate Euler node. And for those who work with the fill curve node, these now have a group ID input to limit filling the specific curve group. And there is also this beautiful update that is now available within the node tools, which I think would be super cool for those creating node tools like we mentioned in 4.0. So node tools are now supported in object mode as well. You can now create your node tools and get them applied to your model within the object mode rather than relying only on the edit or the sculpting mode to get your node tools to work. And for those who like to see the node tools and how you can build them, we've already covered a couple of videos about them, so simply go over to the link in the description and check them out. And in terms of modifiers, there is a couple of interesting updates for that. There's also some performance updates within the geometry nodes, as the extrude mesh node can now be more than 6 times faster for large meshes with any vertex group. The short edge path node can now be 60 times faster, the face group boundary node can now be 3 times faster, and the edge to face group node can now be 7 times faster. And for cycles, Open Image Denoiser is now GPU accelerated on supported hardwares. You can now take full advantage of this, as this makes full quality denoising available at interactive rates within your 3D viewport. And the GPUs that are supported includes the NVIDIA GTX 16XX series, all the way to the Titan V, and all RTX GPUs. And if we take a look at this in Blender 4.1, you can see that this is actually working. So if we go over to our rendering with cycles, make sure that this is GPU. And if we go down to where we have our denoise, we can toggle this from optics to Open Image Denoiser. And once we turn on Open Image Denoiser and say use GPU, that starts using GPU. We can turn this off, and then it uses the CPU to do all of the denoising. And since we have an RTX with over 40 something gig of RAM, why not turn this on? And so this is how you can get it going. If you like to increase the samples and all that stuff, the GPU will handle this really fine, especially if you do have the recommended GPU that was mentioned in the page which we just looked at. On the other hand, if we go back to 4.0 and we switch this to rendering with cycles, the same GPU, go all the way down and switch this to the Open Image Denoiser, you can see that it already tells us with the tooltip that it uses the Intel Open Image Denoiser AI Denoiser, which runs on the CPU. So if we turn this on and then we start increasing the samples, you can also see that this takes a little bit of some milliseconds to get it going compared to what we have with the GPU. So just in case you do have a GPU and you're thinking about getting that denoiser happening, then of course you can simply go ahead and explore this with it. Other than that, the AMD GPU rendering support have been added to the RDNA 3 generation APUs, and Linux CPU rendering performance was improved by about 5% across benchmarks. And with this said, let's take a look at the rendering. And within the rendering section, the pointer and the spotlight now have a new soft fall off option, and this makes the light render the same as in Blender 3.6 and earlier versions. This behavior is not physically based, but it helps avoid sharpness boundary when the light intersects with other geometries. This option is enabled by default on new light, and of course you can turn this off. And within the shader node, the Musgrave texture, which we mentioned within the geometry nodes, is also here, as this was previously replaced by the noise texture node. And Hydra also has a couple of updates, as it now supports rendering particle hair systems in addition to the existing geometry node hair curves. There's also an improved support for shader conversion to Material X, including matte node, and the export of large meshes have been parallelized, giving it up to 6 times speed up depending on the scene licensing and hardware. And Hydra, like we've mentioned in previous videos, has to do with USD. And of course, USD within the import and export is having some updates. And the same thing can be said for Alembic, STL, FBX, Stanford PLY, OBJ, and 3ds files. Other than these, there's just one simple update for the add-ons, which has to do with the Rigify. Nested bone collections are now supported by the rig layer UI, and some custom properties now use recently added booleans for checkboxes or toggles, and enum types for drop-down menus. And finally, version 4.1 now upgrades to Python API 3.11, matching the VFX platform of 2024. There's a few breaking changes that deals with for each, the light probes, meshes, material, sequencer, view layer, and some added parameters and properties that has to do with Python that you can find right here. And while we're wrapping up the video, we did notice that the folks at Blender Foundation have updated this. So right now there is EV and the viewport, but this just simply has one tiny update which deals with the light probe, as some of these things have been renamed. So the reflection cube map is now sphere, reflection plane is not plane, irradiance grid is now volume. Something else which is also worth mentioning is within the sculpting section, there is a very tiny set of update which deals with the voxel remesh attribute preservation that has been changed to propagate all attributes and to improve performance. Additionally, there is a brush setting for view and normal auto-masking values. So this is it. For those who like to take a look at all of this, then you might want to go over to the link in the description and check this out. Also, if you'd like to find out some very cool, interesting stuff about Blender 4.1 and some stuff that we've covered about Blender previously, then you might want to go over to the channel and check this out for yourself. And for those looking for add-ons that they can work with, some recent ones have just been announced and we're going to link those as well in the description. Blender 4.1 seems to be coming with a good set of updates and improvements rather than heavy features like we've seen in previous versions of Blender. Tell me what you guys think about this one in the comment section, and of course if you like this video or you learned something from this, then you can go ahead and give a like and don't forget to share with a friend. And if you're new here, it's going to be amazing for you to hit the subscribe button and also turn on notifications so that you don't miss the next video or the next update. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.